Welcome back to The Sleep Detective. Tonight, we embark on perhaps our most psychologically complex journey yet into the mind of Aileen Wuornos, America's first female serial killer. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore not just the 7 murders that shocked the world, but the devastating psychology that transformed an abused child into the only woman in history to hunt strangers along highways. This case challenges everything we think we know about female violence, about serial killing, and about the thin line between victim and predator. Eileen's story is unique in criminal psychology because she represents something unprecedented: a woman who killed like a man, who hunted like a predator, yet whose psychology was forged entirely through victimization. Before we begin this comprehensive exploration, I'd love to know, put in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something fascinating about how this content connects night owls and deep thinkers around the world, each processing these complex psychological patterns in their own space and time. If you find value in these detailed psychological journeys, subscribing helps us continue exploring the darkest corners of human psychology. Each analysis takes weeks of research through court documents, psychiatric evaluations, and expert testimonies to bring you the most comprehensive understanding possible. Tonight's analysis will take us through 11 segments, examining how abandonment, abuse, and survival psychology created one of history's most unique criminal minds. We'll explore psychological concepts that most true crime content never touches: the neuroscience of trauma, the development of dissociative disorders, and the rare phenomenon of female predatory behavior. This isn't about sensationalizing evil, but about understanding the psychological mechanisms that can transform a victim into a predator. We'll examine how societal failures, systemic abuse, and the complete absence of human compassion can create a mind that operates outside normal moral boundaries. What makes Eileen's case particularly important for understanding criminal psychology is that she represents a perfect storm of developmental trauma. Every system designed to protect children failed her systematically and completely. Her case study has become essential reading in forensic psychology programs because it demonstrates the absolute extremes of human psychological damage. Born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen Carol Pittman entered a world that would show her nothing but cruelty from her very first breath. Her leap year birthday would later become symbolic: a life that existed outside normal time, outside normal human experience, outside the boundaries of conventional psychology. The circumstances surrounding her birth were already psychologically toxic. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was just 16 years old, essentially a child herself who lacked any capacity for healthy mothering. Teen pregnancy in the 1950s carried massive social stigma, creating an environment of shame and secrecy around Eileen's very existence. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was already absent from her life before she was born. This wasn't simply a case of abandonment. Leo was a diagnosed schizophrenic with a documented history of child molestation. He would later hang himself in prison while serving time for kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl. The genetic implications of Leo's mental illness cannot be ignored in understanding Eileen's psychology. Schizophrenia has strong hereditary components, and children of schizophrenic parents have significantly higher rates of mental illness, personality disorders, and violent behavior. Aileen inherited not just genetic predisposition, but also the complete absence of any positive paternal influence. Leo's suicide in prison when Aileen was young created what psychologists call ancestral trauma, psychological damage that extends beyond direct experience to include the legacy of family violence and mental illness. Even though she never knew him, Leo's presence haunted her psychology through genetics, family stories, and the mystery of her origins. Diane Wuornos, Eileen's mother, was psychologically unprepared for motherhood in every possible way. At 16, she lacked the emotional maturity, psychological stability, and life experience necessary to provide the secure attachment that forms the foundation of all future relationships. Teen mothers often struggle, but Diane's situation was compounded by the social isolation and shame of her circumstances. When Aileen was just 4 months old, Diane made a decision that would psychologically scar her daughter for life. She abandoned both Aileen and her older brother Keith, leaving them with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. This abandonment occurred during the most critical period of infant brain development. The psychological concept of primal wound describes the deep trauma that occurs when a child is separated from their biological mother during the critical bonding period. For Aileen, this separation at 4 months old created fundamental neurological damage that would affect her ability to trust, love, and connect with others throughout her entire life. The developing brain of a 4-month-old infant is still forming its most basic neural pathways related to attachment, trust, and emotional regulation. The sudden absence of the mother during this critical period disrupts these developmental processes, creating what researchers call disorganized attachment, a condition where the child simultaneously craves and fears intimate connection. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who experience maternal abandonment in the first year of life have significantly higher rates of personality disorders, particularly borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. The timing of Aileen's abandonment placed her at maximum risk for these conditions. Lori Wuornos, Aileen's grandfather, who became her legal guardian, represented the continuation of her family's cycle of violence and dysfunction. He was a chronic alcoholic with documented violent tendencies and a history of abusing both his wife and children. Taking in 2 more children to abuse wasn't charity, it was opportunity. The household that Aileen entered was built on deception and psychological manipulation. She and Keith were told that Lori and Britta were their parents, and that their actual mother Diane was their sister. This fundamental lie about family identity created confusion and distrust that would plague Aileen's understanding of relationships forever. This deception about her parentage wasn't just a white lie, it was psychological abuse that prevented Aileen from understanding her own identity and origins. Children need truth about their family history to develop a coherent sense of self. By denying her this truth, Lori ensured that her identity would remain fractured and confused. From the earliest age, Aileen was subjected to severe physical abuse by Lori that went far beyond normal corporal punishment. He would beat her with belts, extension cords, and whatever objects were available. But the physical violence was only one component of a systematic campaign of psychological torture designed to break her spirit. The unpredictability of these beatings created a constant state of hypervigilance in young Aileen. She could never relax, never feel safe, never know when the next attack would come. This chronic state of fear fundamentally altered her brain development, creating neural pathways organized around threat detection and survival rather than learning and growth. The psychological impact of living in constant fear cannot be overstated. Aileen's developing nervous system was forced to adapt to an environment where safety never existed. This created what trauma specialists call complex PTSD, a condition where the entire personality becomes organized around surviving ongoing trauma during critical developmental periods. Brain scans of adults with complex PTSD show permanent alterations in areas responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and moral reasoning. These changes begin in early childhood and become more pronounced with ongoing abuse. Aileen's brain was literally being rewired by trauma to prioritize survival over all other functions. Britta Wuornos, Aileen's grandmother, was also an alcoholic who provided no protection from Lori's violence. In fact, psychological records suggest that Britta was complicit in much of the abuse, either participating directly or enabling it through her silence and inaction. This meant that Aileen had no safe adult figure in her life. The absence of even one protective adult figure is devastating to child development. Research shows that children can survive tremendous trauma if they have just one consistently caring adult in their lives. Aileen had none. Every adult in her world was either actively abusive or passively enabling abuse. This complete absence of protection taught Aileen that adults were fundamentally untrustworthy and that the world was a hostile place where she could rely only on herself. This lesson, learned so early and so thoroughly, would make it nearly impossible for her to form healthy relationships or trust authority figures throughout her life. By age 5, Aileen was already showing signs of severe psychological disturbance that should have alarmed any observant adult. She would have explosive fits of rage that were disproportionate to any trigger. She displayed cruelty toward animals, pulling wings off insects, hurting pets, showing no empathy for suffering creatures. These behaviors weren't simply acting out or normal childhood difficulties, they were her developing psyche's attempt to process unprocessable trauma. When children cannot make sense of their experiences through normal psychological mechanisms, they often act out their pain through violence toward weaker beings. The cruelty toward animals is particularly significant in criminal psychology because it's one of the strongest predictors of future violence toward humans. Children who torture animals are often reenacting their own victimization, taking the role of the perpetrator as a way to feel powerful instead of powerless. The community around Aileen failed her completely during these early years. Teachers, neighbors, and other adults who witnessed her obvious distress took no action to protect her. This societal abandonment reinforced her developing belief that the world was fundamentally hostile and that no help would ever come from external sources. School became another source of trauma rather than the refuge it should have been. Aileen was mocked by other children for her appearance, her smell, and her aggressive behavior. Children can be cruel, but they're also intuitive. They sensed something damaged about Aileen and responded with the typical childhood response to difference, rejection, and mockery. This peer rejection during critical social development years further damaged her ability to form healthy relationships. If adults had failed her, perhaps other children might have provided some connection. Instead, school became another environment where she learned that she was fundamentally unacceptable and alone. The psychological concept of learned helplessness began taking root in Aileen's psyche during these early years. Despite fighting back against abuse, screaming, crying, and resisting, nothing she did could stop the violence. This taught her that resistance was often futile, but it also planted seeds of rage that would later explode into lethal violence. What makes Aileen's case psychologically unique is how early and how completely she was abandoned by every system designed to protect children. Family, community, school, religious institutions, and social services all failed her systematically. This total abandonment created a psychological state that researchers are only beginning to understand. By age 6, Aileen had already learned the fundamental lessons that would shape her entire life. Survival meant trusting no one, expecting violence, and preparing to fight back. These lessons, learned so early and so thoroughly, would shape every relationship and every decision for the rest of her life. The child who would become America's most notorious female serial killer was already psychologically formed by the complete failure of human compassion around her. The foundation of trauma, abandonment, and violence was laid so early and so thoroughly that it would prove nearly impossible to overcome. As Aileen entered her pre-adolescent years, the foundation of trauma established in early childhood would be built upon with even more devastating psychological damage. The period between ages 7 and 14 would introduce sexual abuse into an already fractured psyche, creating the complex trauma profile that would later manifest in her unique form of serial killing. The transition from childhood physical abuse to adolescent sexual abuse represents a crucial escalation in Eileen's psychological damage. While physical abuse had taught her that her body could be hurt, sexual abuse would teach her that her body could be used, exploited, and degraded in ways that went far beyond simple violence. Around age 7, Aileen began experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of her grandfather, Laurie. This wasn't a single incident or even occasional abuse, it was systematic, ongoing sexual torture that continued for years. The regularity and duration of this abuse created what trauma specialists call complex trauma, psychological damage that affects every aspect of personality development. The psychological impact of incestuous abuse by a primary caregiver creates what researchers call betrayal trauma, damage that goes far beyond the physical acts themselves. When the person meant to protect and care for a child becomes their sexual predator, it fundamentally destroys the child's ability to understand safety, trust, and appropriate relationships. The developing adolescent brain processes sexual abuse in ways that fundamentally alter neural pathways related to sexuality, intimacy, and self-worth. For Aileen, sexual contact became associated not with love, pleasure, or even normal human connection, but with pain, dominance, submission, and survival. This warped understanding of sexuality would plague every relationship she ever attempted. What makes Laurie's abuse particularly psychologically damaging is the psychological concept of double bind. He was simultaneously her protector and her predator, her caregiver and her tormentor. Children in these situations experience profound cognitive dissonance because their developing minds cannot reconcile these contradictory roles. This cognitive dissonance creates deep psychological fractures that manifest as dissociation, identity confusion, and an inability to trust one's own perceptions of reality. Aileen learned to survive by psychologically separating from her experiences, a coping mechanism that would later allow her to commit violence with remarkable emotional detachment. Eileen's brother Keith was also subjected to sexual abuse by Laurie, creating a shared trauma bond between the siblings. While one might expect this shared experience to provide comfort and solidarity, it instead created a conspiracy of silence and shame that prevented either child from seeking help or even acknowledging the full reality of their situation. The psychological dynamics of sibling abuse survivors are complex and often destructive. Rather than protecting each other, Keith and Aileen often competed for Laurie's attention and approval, even when that attention included abuse. This competition taught them that other people, even those who shared their pain, were ultimately rivals for limited resources. The psychological concept of learned sexuality is crucial to understanding Eileen's later relationships and criminal behavior. Her earliest and most formative sexual experiences were violent, non-consensual, and tied directly to survival. This taught her fundamental lessons about sexuality that would never be unlearned. She learned that sex was something done to her, not with her. She learned that her sexual value was the only currency she possessed. She learned that sexual encounters were about power, control, and survival, rather than affection, pleasure, or human connection. These lessons became so deeply embedded that they formed the core of her sexual identity. By age 9, Aileen was already displaying hypersexualized behavior that alarmed even the dysfunctional adults around her. This wasn't normal childhood curiosity about sexuality, it was trauma reenactment, her psyche's attempt to process experiences that were beyond her developmental capacity to understand. Hypersexualized behavior in young children is one of the clearest indicators of sexual abuse. Yet the adults in Eileen's life interpreted it as evidence of her inherent moral corruption rather than recognizing it as a cry for help. This misinterpretation reinforced her growing belief that she was fundamentally bad and deserving of mistreatment. The community's response to Eileen's sexualized behavior was to label her as bad, promiscuous, or troubled rather than investigating the obvious signs of abuse. This victim-blaming response from adults who should have protected her further reinforced her belief that she was fundamentally flawed and that her suffering was her own fault. This victim-blaming created what psychologists call toxic shame, a deep belief that one is inherently defective, worthless, and deserving of abuse. Unlike healthy guilt, which is about behavior that can be changed, toxic shame is about identity and creates a sense of being fundamentally unworthy of love or protection. Around age 10, Aileen began trading sexual favors for cigarettes, alcohol, and small amounts of money with older boys and men in her neighborhood. While adults viewed this as evidence of her moral corruption and precocious sexuality, psychologically it represented something far more complex and tragic. This early prostitution wasn't motivated by sexual desire, rebellion, or even desperate need for money. It was a psychological attempt to transform her victimization into something resembling choice and agency. By initiating these exchanges, she could maintain an illusion of control that helped her psyche cope with the powerlessness she felt in every other area of her life. The psychological need for agency is fundamental to human mental health. When children are completely powerless, they will often engage in self-destructive behaviors simply to feel that they have some control over their circumstances. Aileen's prostitution gave her the illusion that she was choosing what was happening to her body. These early sexual transactions also taught Aileen that her body was a commodity that could be exchanged for temporary relief, small rewards, or basic necessities. This commodification of her own sexuality would become central to her survival strategy and her understanding of her own value as a human being. The men who participated in these exchanges with a 10-year-old child were clearly predators taking advantage of an obviously damaged and vulnerable child. Yet none of them reported the abuse or attempted to help her. Instead, they became part of the network of exploitation that surrounded her. The shame associated with her sexual behavior became deeply internalized during these years. Aileen began to believe that she was fundamentally dirty, worthless, and deserving of abuse. This core belief about herself would drive many of her later decisions and relationships, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of degradation and violence. The psychological concept of repetition compulsion explains why trauma survivors often recreate their traumatic experiences in new relationships. Having learned that relationships involve exploitation and abuse, Aileen would unconsciously seek out situations that confirmed these expectations. Around age 11, Aileen became pregnant, most likely as a result of rape by Laurie or one of the men she was trading sex with. The pregnancy represented a biological consequence of psychological trauma that her young mind couldn't fully comprehend. She was a child carrying a child conceived through violence and exploitation. The psychological impact of pregnancy at such a young age cannot be overstated. Her body was being used to create life while her psyche was being systematically destroyed. This contradiction created deep psychological confusion about the nature of her own body, sexuality, reproductive capacity, and worth as a human being. Pregnancy at 11 also meant that Aileen's already disrupted childhood was completely terminated. Any possibility of normal adolescent development, education, or social relationships was eliminated. She was forced into adult consequences for situations entirely beyond her control or understanding. When Laurie discovered the pregnancy, his response revealed the depth of his psychological cruelty. Rather than showing concern for his granddaughter's welfare or taking responsibility for the abuse that had caused the pregnancy, he responded with violent rage and blamed Aileen entirely for the situation. He beat Aileen severely and arranged for her to be sent away to a home for unwed mothers. This response reinforced the psychological message that she was the problem, not the abuse she had endured. The victim was being punished while the perpetrators faced no consequences. The experience of being sent away during pregnancy created another layer of abandonment trauma. At the moment when she most needed support and protection, she was instead isolated and hidden away like a shameful secret. This reinforced her belief that she was fundamentally unacceptable and that her suffering didn't matter to anyone. The home for unwed mothers in the 1960s was often little better than a prison. These institutions were designed to hide pregnant girls from society and shame them into giving up their babies for adoption. For Aileen, it was another environment where she was treated as a problem to be managed rather than a child to be protected. The experience of giving birth at such a young age was traumatic in ways that extended far beyond the physical pain and danger. Aileen was forced to endure labor and delivery while still being psychologically and physically a child herself. The medical staff often treated young mothers with judgment and cruelty rather than compassion. After giving birth, Aileen was forced to give up the baby for adoption. This created another profound layer of abandonment and loss. She had been abandoned by her parents, abused by her caregivers, and now was forced to abandon her own child. The cycle of abandonment was becoming complete. The psychological impact of forced adoption after abuse-induced pregnancy creates what researchers call ambiguous loss, grief for someone who is alive but permanently lost. Aileen would carry this loss for the rest of her life, often wondering about the child she was forced to give away. The psychological concept of traumatic bonding helps explain why Aileen didn't simply run away or report the abuse during these years. Her survival had become dependent on the very people who were destroying her. This creates a complex psychological attachment where the victim becomes emotionally and practically dependent on their abuser. Traumatic bonding is reinforced through intermittent reinforcement, occasional moments of kindness or relief that create hope and attachment even in severely abusive relationships. Even small gestures of humanity from Lori would have created powerful psychological bonds that made leaving seem impossible. During her early teenage years, Eileen's relationship with her brother Keith became her only source of emotional connection and understanding. Keith was the only person who truly comprehended her experiences because he shared them. However, their bond was built on mutual trauma rather than healthy sibling affection. This trauma bond with Keith would remain one of the few stable relationships in Eileen's life. But it was also fundamentally unhealthy because it was based on shared victimization rather than mutual support and growth. Their connection was forged in survival rather than love. The school system continued to fail Aileen catastrophically during these crucial developmental years. Her academic performance was poor, her behavior was increasingly aggressive and sexualized, and her appearance often showed obvious signs of neglect and abuse. Yet no teacher, counselor, or administrator took meaningful action to investigate or intervene. The psychological isolation Aileen experienced during adolescence was nearly complete. She had no trusted adults, no healthy peer relationships, no safe spaces where she could simply be a child or teenager. This isolation taught her that survival meant complete self-reliance, and that other people represented either threats to be avoided or opportunities for exploitation. By age 14, the years of sexual abuse had created what psychologists call a trauma identity, a sense of self that was entirely organized around surviving abuse and exploitation. Aileen no longer had access to the parts of herself that might have developed into healthy relationships, appropriate boundaries, or basic self-worth. The coping mechanisms she developed during these years of sexual abuse would later become central to her criminal psychology. She learned to dissociate during traumatic experiences, to view her body as separate from her mind, to respond to perceived threats with immediate and overwhelming aggression, and to see all relationships as fundamentally exploitative. At age 14, after giving birth and being forced to surrender her child for adoption, Aileen returned to the Wuornos household, only to face continued abuse and an environment that had become even more hostile and dangerous. The pregnancy had marked her as irredeemably damaged in the eyes of her grandparents, and any pretense of family care was now completely abandoned. The psychological impact of returning to her abusers after such a traumatic experience cannot be overstated. Aileen had hoped that perhaps the birth experience, the forced separation from her child, and the obvious consequences of the abuse might create some recognition of her suffering and need for protection. Instead, she found only increased hostility and blame. Lori's response to her return was to intensify both the physical and sexual abuse. Having successfully forced her to give away the evidence of his crimes, he now felt emboldened to continue his exploitation with even less restraint. The psychological message was clear. She existed solely for his use and had no value beyond what he could extract from her. The realization that nothing would ever change in that household created what psychologists call a psychological break, a moment when the mind recognizes that survival requires abandoning all previous assumptions about safety, family, and belonging. For Aileen, this break would lead to a decision that would define the rest of her life. Rather than continue enduring the escalating abuse, Aileen made the choice to leave the only home she had ever known and survive on the streets. While this might seem like an obvious decision, for a 14-year-old with no resources, no education, no family support, and no understanding of the world beyond abuse, it represented an extraordinary act of psychological courage and desperation. The decision to choose homelessness over the horror of her home life demonstrates the extreme nature of what she was enduring. Most children, no matter how bad their family situation, cannot conceive of survival outside the family structure. Aileen's choice to leave indicates that she had reached a psychological breaking point where death seemed preferable to continued abuse. The streets of Michigan in the early 1970s were particularly dangerous for a young girl with no resources or protection. Aileen entered this environment with a psychology already shaped by years of systematic abuse, making her both more vulnerable to exploitation and more likely to respond to threats with immediate violence. Her first experiences of homelessness were characterized by a desperate search for the basic necessities of survival: food, shelter, and safety. Having learned from years of abuse that nothing was given freely and everything required payment, Aileen immediately understood that her body was the only currency she possessed. The transition from childhood sexual abuse to teenage prostitution represented a psychological continuation rather than a dramatic change. The same lessons that had governed her survival in the Wuornos household, that sex was about power and survival rather than affection, that her body was a tool for others' use, that relationships were fundamentally exploitative, now became the foundation of her street survival strategy. What makes Aileen's early prostitution psychologically unique is that it wasn't driven by drug addiction, pimps, or gradual coercion like many young prostitutes. Instead, it was the immediate and logical extension of survival skills she had already developed through years of sexual abuse. She understood exactly what was expected and how to survive it. The psychological concept of survival sex describes sexual activity engaged in purely for basic necessities like food, shelter, or safety. For Aileen, this wasn't a degrading necessity, but a familiar transaction that felt safer and more predictable than the random violence and abuse she had experienced at home. Her clients during these early years were typically older men who specifically sought out young, vulnerable girls. These men understood they were exploiting a child, but Aileen's psychological development had been so distorted that she often felt more in control during these encounters than she had during the abuse at home. The streets taught Aileen new survival skills that would later become crucial to her criminal psychology. She learned to read potential threats quickly, to assess the dangerousness of situations and people within moments of encounter, and to strike first when she sensed vulnerability or threat. These skills would later enable her to identify and overpower her victims. Living on the streets also introduced Aileen to alcohol as a coping mechanism for psychological pain. Unlike the controlled drinking she had witnessed in her grandparents' home, street drinking was about obliterating consciousness, numbing trauma, and temporarily escaping the constant hypervigilance required for survival. Alcohol became psychologically essential for Aileen because it was the only way she could temporarily quiet the constant internal state of terror and rage that had been building since early childhood. The streets were dangerous, but the psychological landscape inside her mind had become even more threatening and chaotic. The combination of street life and heavy drinking created a psychological state where Aileen existed in a constant fog of trauma, substance abuse, and survival mode. This state would become her baseline for the rest of her life, never fully sober, never truly safe, never psychologically present in a way that allowed for normal human connection. During her early months on the streets, Aileen encountered other homeless youth who were surviving through similar means. However, rather than finding community or support, she discovered that street life was characterized by the same exploitation and violence that had defined her family life, only with less pretense of care or protection. The other homeless youth she encountered were often as damaged and dangerous as the adults who exploited them. Competition for clients, territory, and basic resources created an environment where forming genuine friendships or alliances was nearly impossible. Everyone was a potential threat or competitor for limited survival resources. This environment reinforced all of Eileen's existing psychological patterns while adding new layers of paranoia and aggression. She learned that even people who shared her circumstances couldn't be trusted, that vulnerability was always punished, and that violence was often the most effective solution to problems. The psychological isolation of street life was even more complete than what she had experienced in her family, at least in the Wuornos household. There had been the illusion of belonging to something, even if that something was fundamentally toxic. On the streets, she belonged to nothing and no one, existing in a state of complete social disconnection. This isolation taught Aileen that human connection was not only unnecessary, but actively dangerous. Every person she encountered wanted something from her, and most were willing to use violence to take it. The psychological lesson was clear. Other people were either predators or prey, and survival meant never allowing herself to be prey. The constant threat of violence on the streets created a psychological state of hypervigilance that never turned off. Aileen had to assess every person, every situation, every environment for potential threats while simultaneously appearing confident enough to avoid being targeted by predators who sought out obviously vulnerable victims. This hypervigilance, combined with years of abuse trauma, created what trauma specialists call complex PTSD with dissociative features. Aileen existed in a constant state of partial dissociation, present enough to identify threats, but psychologically removed enough to function despite ongoing trauma. The dissociative state that enabled her street survival would later become crucial to her ability to commit murder. The same psychological mechanism that allowed her to endure sexual exploitation without being completely destroyed by it would later allow her to kill multiple men without being overwhelmed by guilt or emotional connection to her victims. Her early experiences with clients taught her to view men as fundamentally predatory and exploitative. Every man who sought her services was, by definition, someone willing to exploit a homeless teenager for sexual gratification. This experience base would later make it psychologically easy for her to view all men as deserving of violence. The street also taught Aileen about the psychology of power and vulnerability. She learned to identify men who were drunk, distracted, or otherwise vulnerable. She learned how to position herself advantageously in cars and motel rooms. She learned how to read aggression and respond with overwhelming force before becoming a victim herself. These skills, threat assessment, positioning, timing and the willingness to use violence preemptively would later become the foundation of her killing methodology. The same survival skills that kept her alive on the streets would eventually enable her to murder 7 men. The psychological boundary between self-defense and aggression became increasingly blurred during her street years. When survival depends on never allowing yourself to become a victim, the line between protecting yourself and victimizing others becomes almost meaningless. Violence becomes a tool like any other, to be used when necessary for survival. Eileen's understanding of normal social boundaries was further eroded by street life. The conventional rules about appropriate behavior, legal consequences, and moral considerations had no relevance to her daily reality of survival. She lived in a world where violence was routine and law enforcement was either absent or hostile. The rare occasions when police encountered Aileen during her street years typically resulted in arrest for prostitution rather than recognition that she was a child victim of systematic abuse. This taught her that law enforcement was another form of predator rather than a source of protection or justice. Her arrest for prostitution as a minor created a criminal record that would follow her for life. But more importantly, they reinforced her psychological understanding that society viewed her as a criminal rather than a victim. The system's response to her victimization was to criminalize her survival strategies. The psychological impact of being labeled a criminal for survival activities cannot be overstated. Society was telling Aileen that her attempts to avoid death through prostitution were more morally objectionable than the systematic abuse that had driven her to the streets. This message reinforced her growing hatred of social institutions and conventional morality. The cyclical nature of arrest, brief incarceration, and return to the streets created a psychological pattern of expecting punishment for survival. This taught Aileen that seeking help or trusting authorities would only result in more trauma and criminalization, reinforcing her belief that she could rely only on herself. Her time in juvenile detention facilities exposed her to additional trauma and taught her important survival skills that would later prove crucial. She learned about institutional violence, the psychology of predators in confined spaces, and the importance of establishing a reputation for dangerous unpredictability to avoid victimization. The other girls in juvenile detention were often as damaged and dangerous as Aileen herself. Rather than finding sisterhood or support, she discovered that damaged people often become dangerous to each other, competing for limited resources and taking out their trauma on anyone more vulnerable than themselves. Her brother Keith remained her only connection to anything resembling family during these years, but their relationship was complicated by his own survival struggles and the traumatic bonding that had formed between them. Their connection was based on shared damage rather than healthy affection, creating a dynamic that was simultaneously supportive and toxic. The psychological concept of trauma bonding explains why Keith remained important to Aileen despite their dysfunctional relationship. He was the only person who truly understood her experiences, but their bond was forged in mutual victimization rather than love, creating a connection that provided comfort but also reinforced traumatic patterns. By age 16, Aileen had developed what psychologists call a feral psychology, a mental state adapted entirely to survival in hostile environments with no social support or safety. Her mind had become organized around threat detection, resource acquisition, and violence as a primary tool for problem solving. This feral psychology would remain Eileen's baseline for the rest of her life. Even when circumstances improved temporarily, she would never be able to fully trust safety or develop the psychological mechanisms necessary for healthy relationships. Her mind had been permanently altered by years of trauma and street survival. The streets had completed Eileen's psychological transformation from victim to predator. While she had entered street life as a damaged child seeking survival, she emerged as a young woman capable of identifying vulnerability in others and exploiting it for her own benefit. The same skills that had kept her alive would eventually enable her to become a killer. By age 17, Eileen's psychology had evolved from that of a trauma victim seeking survival to something far more dangerous, a predator capable of identifying and exploiting vulnerability in others. The streets had not only taught her to survive, but had fundamentally altered her understanding of human relationships, transforming her from someone who feared violence to someone who wielded it strategically. The first documented instance of Aileen using serious violence occurred during what began as a routine prostitution encounter. A client had become aggressive and violent, attempting to brutalize her beyond the boundaries of their agreed transaction. This moment represented a crucial psychological turning point where Aileen discovered that she was capable of overwhelming violence when threatened. Rather than simply defending herself or escaping the situation, Eileen's response was disproportionately violent. She didn't just fight back, she destroyed her attacker with a ferocity that surprised even her. This experience taught her a crucial psychological lesson. Violence wasn't just a survival tool, it was a source of power and control that she had never experienced before. The psychological aftermath of this first serious violent encounter was complex and revelatory. Instead of experiencing trauma, guilt, or horror at what she had done, Aileen felt something she had rarely experienced in her life, a sense of complete control and power. For the first time, she had been the one inflicting rather than receiving violence. This experience triggered what psychologists call a power reversal, a psychological transformation where a chronic victim discovers their capacity to become the victimizer. For someone who had spent their entire life being powerless, the sensation of having life and death control over another person was intoxicating and addictive. The neurochemical response to successful violence and trauma survivors is particularly complex. The brain releases a flood of endorphins, adrenaline, and other neurochemicals that create a powerful high. For someone like Aileen, who had never experienced healthy sources of empowerment or control, this chemical response became psychologically addictive. What makes this psychological transformation particularly dangerous is that it occurred in someone whose moral development had been completely corrupted by years of abuse and survival. Aileen had no internalized ethical framework that might have created guilt or revulsion at her violent behavior. Instead, violence felt like justice, power, and control. The psychological concept of moral disengagement explains how people can commit acts of violence without experiencing psychological distress. Eileen's moral disengagement had been developing for years through systematic abuse, and this first serious violent encounter completed the process of disconnecting her actions from conventional moral consequences. Following this initial violent encounter, Aileen began actively seeking situations where she might need to use violence. She started carrying weapons, first knives, then eventually guns, not just for protection, but as tools of empowerment. The weapons gave her a psychological sense of control that she had never experienced. The transition from defensive violence to predatory violence is often gradual and subtle, but for Aileen it was relatively rapid. Having discovered that she was capable of overwhelming violence and that it felt empowering rather than traumatic, she began looking for opportunities to exercise this newfound power. Her prostitution work became increasingly dangerous as she began targeting clients who appeared vulnerable or isolated. Rather than simply providing sexual services and avoiding trouble, she started identifying men who were drunk, distracted, or otherwise vulnerable to attack. This represented a fundamental shift from survival prostitution to predatory prostitution. The psychological process of dehumanization became central to Eileen's evolving criminal psychology. Years of being treated as less than human had taught her to view others in the same way. Her clients weren't people with lives, families, or inherent worth. They were objects to be used for her survival and, increasingly, her empowerment. This dehumanization process was facilitated by the nature of her prostitution work. Every client was, by definition, someone willing to exploit an obviously damaged young woman for sexual gratification. In Eileen's mind, this made them all complicit in a system that had destroyed her life, making them deserving of whatever violence she might inflict. The psychological concept of righteous violence explains how people can commit acts of extreme aggression while feeling morally justified. Aileen began developing an internal narrative where her violence against men was justified revenge for the lifetime of abuse she had suffered at the hands of men. Her brother Keith's death around this time created another psychological crisis that further destabilized her already fragile mental state. Keith had been her only connection to anything resembling family or human affection. His loss eliminated her last emotional anchor and removed any remaining psychological barriers to complete antisocial behavior. The grief over Keith's death was complicated by the traumatic nature of their relationship. She mourned not just his loss, but the loss of the only person who truly understood her experiences. This grief was mixed with rage at being abandoned once again by the only person who had provided any emotional connection. Keith's death also triggered what psychologists call survivor guilt, a complex emotional state where trauma survivors feel guilty for surviving when others didn't. This guilt was particularly complex for Aileen because Keith's death meant that she was now the sole keeper of their shared traumatic memories. The psychological isolation that followed Keith's death was complete and devastating. With no family connections, no healthy relationships, and no social support systems, Aileen existed in a state of total disconnection from normal human society. This isolation removed any remaining social pressure to conform to conventional moral standards. During this period, Eileen's alcohol and drug use escalated dramatically as she attempted to cope with the grief and rage over Keith's death. The substances didn't just numb her pain, they also lowered her inhibitions and made violent behavior even more likely and more extreme when it occurred. The combination of grief, rage, isolation, and substance abuse created what psychologists call a psychological perfect storm, a mental state where violent behavior becomes not just possible but inevitable. All of the psychological barriers that might have prevented extreme violence had been systematically removed. Her romantic relationships during this period were characterized by the same patterns of exploitation and violence that had defined all of her relationships. She was drawn to partners who were as damaged and dangerous as herself, creating relationships that reinforced rather than challenged her antisocial patterns. These relationships often involved mutual exploitation, with both partners using violence, manipulation, and abuse to control each other. Rather than providing emotional support or stability, these relationships became additional sources of trauma and conflict that further destabilized her psychology. The psychological concept of trauma bonding explains why Aileen was attracted to abusive partners. Having learned in childhood that love and violence were inseparable, she couldn't recognize healthy affection and was only comfortable with relationships that included familiar patterns of abuse and control. Her criminal behavior during this period escalated beyond prostitution to include robbery, assault, and other violent crimes. This escalation represented not just increasing desperation for money but a growing psychological addiction to the power and control that violence provided. The robberies she committed were often unnecessarily violent, going far beyond what was needed to obtain money or goods. This excessive violence indicates that the crimes were serving psychological needs beyond simple resource acquisition. They were feeding her growing addiction to power and control. Law enforcement encounters during this period typically resulted in brief incarcerations that only served to further criminalize and dehumanize Aileen, rather than providing any form of intervention or support. Each arrest reinforced her belief that society viewed her as irredeemably criminal rather than as a victim of systematic abuse. The psychological impact of repeated incarceration on someone with Aileen's trauma history cannot be overstated. Rather than serving as deterrent or rehabilitation, jail time became additional trauma that reinforced all of her existing antisocial patterns while teaching her new criminal skills and connections. Her behavior in jail was characterized by the same hypervigilance and preemptive aggression that governed her street behavior. She quickly established a reputation for dangerous unpredictability that protected her from other inmates but also reinforced her identity as someone defined by violence and threat. The other inmates she encountered were often career criminals who provided education in more sophisticated criminal techniques. Rather than encountering people who might challenge her antisocial behavior, jail exposed her to individuals who normalized and encouraged even more extreme criminal behavior. The psychological concept of criminal socialization explains how exposure to career criminals can accelerate antisocial development. Aileen learned not just new criminal techniques, but also psychological justifications for increasingly extreme behavior from inmates who had successfully suppressed their own moral qualms about violence. Her release from each incarceration was followed by increasingly extreme criminal behavior, indicating that jail time was serving as a criminal education rather than deterrent. Each cycle of arrest, incarceration, and release moved her further along the path toward the extreme violence that would eventually make her famous. The psychological trajectory during this period was clear and ominous. Aileen was evolving from a trauma victim who used violence defensively to a predator who used violence strategically for psychological empowerment. The transformation was nearly complete, requiring only the right combination of circumstances to trigger the killing spree that would follow. Her weapon carrying became more sophisticated and strategic during this period. She graduated from carrying knives for protection to carrying guns for the specific purpose of overpowering and controlling victims. The weapons became extensions of her psychology tools for exercising the ultimate form of power and control. The psychological preparation for murder was occurring gradually through these escalating violent encounters. Each act of violence made the next one easier. Each successful use of extreme force made even more extreme force seem justified and necessary. She was psychologically rehearsing for murder without consciously planning it. The dehumanization of potential victims became complete during this period. Men who sought her services weren't people deserving of basic human consideration. They were representatives of all the men who had ever hurt her, symbols of a system that had destroyed her life, and objects deserving of whatever violence she chose to inflict. The psychological stage was now set for murder. Aileen possessed the weapons, the skills, the psychological justification, and the complete moral disengagement necessary to kill. All that remained was the right combination of circumstances, opportunity, and trigger to transform her from someone capable of murder into someone who actually committed it. The evolution from victim to predator was complete, representing one of the most dramatic psychological transformations documented in criminal psychology. The abused child had become the serial killer, not through any single dramatic event, but through the systematic erosion of every psychological barrier that might have prevented such extreme violence. On November 30, 1989, at age 33, Aileen Wuornos crossed the ultimate psychological threshold when she murdered Richard Mallory along a Florida highway. This wasn't a random explosion of violence, but the inevitable culmination of decades of psychological development that had systematically removed every barrier between thought and lethal action. Understanding this first murder is crucial because it reveals the psychological mechanisms that would enable 6 more killings. The encounter with Richard Mallory began as what appeared to be a routine prostitution transaction. Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, had picked up Aileen along Highway 75, and they had driven to a secluded area to conduct their business. From the outside, this looked like countless other transactions Aileen had engaged in over nearly 2 decades of survival prostitution. However, the psychological dynamics of this encounter were fundamentally different from Eileen's previous violent incidents. By 1989, her mental state had deteriorated to the point where the line between defensive violence and predatory aggression had become completely blurred. She was no longer simply a victim defending herself, she had become a predator actively seeking opportunities for violence. The specific details of what transpired between Aileen and Mallory in those final moments remain disputed, but the psychological framework that enabled the murder is clear. Eileen's mind had been conditioned through decades of trauma to interpret any form of male aggression or dominance as a life-threatening situation requiring immediate and overwhelming response. What makes this murder psychologically significant is that it represents the moment when Eileen's trauma responses evolved from defensive mechanisms into predatory behavior. The same hypervigilance and preemptive aggression that had kept her alive on the streets now became tools for identifying and exploiting vulnerability in potential victims. The psychological concept of threat generalization explains how trauma survivors can begin to perceive threats in situations where none actually exist. For Aileen, any man who displayed dominance, aggression, or control became indistinguishable from every man who had ever abused her. Mallory wasn't just a client, he was a symbol of every abuser she had ever encountered. The act of killing itself triggered a complex psychological response in Aileen that combined elements of power, relief, justice, and terror. For the first time in her life, she had exercised the ultimate form of control over another human being. The psychological rush of this absolute power was intoxicating in a way that her previous violent encounters had only hinted at. The neurochemical response to committing murder in someone with Eileen's psychological profile is particularly intense. The brain releases massive amounts of adrenaline, endorphins, and other neurochemicals that create a powerful high. For someone who had spent her entire life feeling powerless, this chemical flood represented the ultimate form of empowerment. What makes Eileen's psychological response to her first murder unique is the absence of guilt, horror, or moral revulsion that typically follows such acts. Instead of experiencing the psychological breakdown that might be expected after crossing such an extreme moral boundary, she felt validated, empowered, and psychologically justified in her actions. This absence of guilt is explained by the psychological concept of moral disengagement, a process where individuals can commit acts of extreme violence without experiencing moral distress. Eileen's moral disengagement had been developing for decades through systematic abuse, complete social abandonment, and the dehumanization she had experienced at the hands of every institution supposedly designed to protect her. The practical aftermath of the murder also provided psychological rewards that reinforced the behavior. She took Mallory's car, money, and possessions, providing her with resources and mobility that represented concrete benefits from the killing. This taught her that murder wasn't just psychologically satisfying, but also practically advantageous. The psychological process of behavioral reinforcement explains how actions that provide both psychological and practical rewards become more likely to be repeated. The murder had satisfied Eileen's psychological need for power and control while also providing material resources for survival, creating a powerful reinforcement loop that made future killings more probable. Her behavior in the hours and days following the murder reveals the depth of her psychological transformation. Rather than experiencing panic, horror, or attempts to confess or surrender, she calmly disposed of evidence and continued her normal activities. This indicates that the murder had been psychologically integrated as justified and appropriate rather than as a traumatic aberration. The psychological concept of cognitive consonance explains how individuals can integrate extreme behaviors into their self-concept without experiencing distress. Eileen's narrative about the murder, that it was justified self-defense against a violent predator, allowed her to maintain psychological stability while committing acts that would normally cause severe mental breakdown. The dehumanization of Mallory was complete both during and after the murder. He wasn't a person with a life, family, hopes, and fears. He was a representative of every man who had ever hurt her, a symbol of systematic male oppression, and an object deserving of destruction. This dehumanization made the killing psychologically possible and emotionally satisfying. The murder also triggered what psychologists call fantasy elaboration, the development of increasingly detailed mental scenarios about future violence. Having successfully killed once, Eileen's mind began planning and rehearsing future murders, not as desperate acts of self-defense, but as intentional exercises of power and control. The psychological boundary between fantasy and reality had become dangerously thin in Eileen's mind. The years of trauma, substance abuse, and social isolation had created a mental state where violent fantasies felt as real and valid as actual experiences. The successful murder made these fantasies feel achievable and desirable. Her ability to conceal the murder and continue functioning normally reveals the sophisticated psychological compartmentalization she had developed through years of trauma. The same dissociative mechanisms that had allowed her to survive childhood sexual abuse now enabled her to commit murder without psychological breakdown. The psychological concept of dissociative splitting explains how severely traumatized individuals can separate different aspects of their experience and behavior into distinct psychological compartments. Aileen could be a killer in one compartment while maintaining other aspects of her personality and functioning in separate psychological spaces. The success of her first murder also validated her growing belief that violence was the most effective solution to life's problems. Rather than causing psychological distress, the killing reinforced her antisocial worldview and confirmed that extreme aggression was not only justified but practically advantageous. The investigation into Mallory's disappearance and the discovery of his body created no psychological pressure or deterrent effect for Aileen. Having successfully evaded immediate consequences, she interpreted the lack of arrest as confirmation that she could continue killing without significant risk of punishment. The psychological concept of success attribution explains how individuals who successfully commit crimes often attribute their success to their own skill and planning rather than to luck or circumstance. This creates overconfidence that makes future crimes more likely and often more reckless. Her relationship patterns following the murder remained unchanged, indicating that the killing had been psychologically integrated as normal behavior rather than as a traumatic exception. She continued engaging in the same destructive relationships, substance abuse, and criminal behavior that had characterized her life before the murder. The murder of Mallory also eliminated any remaining psychological barriers to killing that might have existed in Eileen's mind. Having crossed the ultimate moral boundary once, subsequent killings would require much less psychological preparation or justification. The precedent had been established. The psychological trajectory from this first murder to the subsequent killings was clear and predictable. Each additional murder would be easier psychologically, require less justification, and provide diminishing emotional rewards, leading to an escalating pattern of violence as she sought to recreate the psychological high of that first successful killing. Her choice of victim type was also psychologically significant. By targeting men who sought prostitutes, she ensured that her victims would be isolated, unlikely to be quickly missed, and psychologically easy for her to dehumanize. These men represented perfect targets for someone with her particular psychological profile and criminal methodology. The location of the murder along a highway also reveals psychological planning and criminal sophistication. Highways provide anonymity, quick escape routes, and reduced likelihood of witnesses, indicating that even her first murder involved strategic thinking rather than purely impulsive violence. The weapon choice, a handgun, reflects the evolution of her violence from defensive to predatory. Unlike knives or other close contact weapons that might be used defensively, guns are tools of execution that require premeditation and create psychological distance between killer and victim. The psychological aftermath of successfully committing and concealing her first murder created what criminologists call a cooling-off period, a time when the psychological and practical lessons of the crime are integrated and plans for future violence are developed. For Aileen, this period would last several months before the next killing. During this cooling-off period, the psychological addiction to the power and control provided by murder began to develop. Like any addiction, it would require increasingly frequent and intense experiences to provide the same psychological satisfaction, leading to an accelerating pattern of violence. The psychological foundation for serial killing was now complete. Aileen had demonstrated to herself that she could kill, conceal the crime, and continue functioning normally. More importantly, she had discovered that murder provided psychological rewards that nothing else in her life had ever offered: ultimate power, complete control, and perfect revenge against a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The transformation from trauma victim to serial killer was now complete. The next murder would be easier. The one after that easier still, until killing became as routine and psychologically unremarkable as any other survival strategy she had developed during her decades of abuse and abandonment. The psychological stage was set for the killing spree that would make Aileen Wuornos one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. The first murder had broken the final psychological barrier and revealed to her a source of power and control that would prove irresistibly addictive. Following the successful murder of Richard Mallory, Aileen entered what criminal psychologists call the pattern development phase of serial killing. This period, lasting several months, was characterized by psychological integration of her first murder, refinement of her killing methodology, and the development of sophisticated victim selection criteria that would define her subsequent crimes. The psychological aftermath of successfully killing and evading immediate consequences created a fundamental shift in Aileen's self-perception and relationship to violence. She was no longer someone who used violence defensively or even aggressively. She had become someone capable of calculated, predatory murder, who could function normally while carrying the secret of her ultimate transgression. The months following Mallory's murder were psychologically crucial because they allowed Aileen to process and integrate the experience of killing into her existing psychological framework. Rather than causing breakdown or moral crisis, the murder was seamlessly incorporated into her survival narrative as a justified and effective response to male aggression and exploitation. This psychological integration process was facilitated by Aileen's long-standing pattern of moral disengagement and victim blaming. In her mind, Mallory hadn't been an innocent victim, but a representative of every man who had ever exploited or abused her. His death was justice rather than murder, revenge rather than crime. The psychological concept of cognitive restructuring explains how individuals can reframe extreme behaviors to maintain psychological stability. Aileen's murder of Mallory wasn't reconstructed as a moment of lost control or moral failure, but as a successful assertion of power and protection against male predation. During this integration period, Aileen's behavior patterns remained largely unchanged, indicating the remarkable psychological compartmentalization she had developed. She continued her prostitution work, maintained her relationships, and engaged in her usual activities while secretly processing the knowledge that she was now a killer. This psychological compartmentalization was enabled by the same dissociative mechanisms that had allowed her to survive decades of abuse. The murder existed in a separate psychological space from her daily functioning, accessible when needed, but not interfering with her ability to maintain normal activities and relationships. The psychological addiction to the power and control provided by murder began developing during this period. Like any addiction, it created psychological cravings that grew stronger over time. The memory of absolute dominance over Mallory became increasingly compelling as the psychological high from the experience began to fade. Her victim selection criteria became increasingly sophisticated during this period as she unconsciously prepared for future killings. Rather than simply accepting any client who approached her, she began evaluating potential customers for their vulnerability, isolation, and suitability as potential murder victims. The psychological process of predatory assessment became central to Eileen's interaction with potential clients. She learned to quickly evaluate factors such as physical size, apparent wealth, level of intoxication, likelihood of being missed quickly, and ease of overpowering. These assessments became automatic and unconscious. Her preference for highway encounters wasn't accidental, but reflected sophisticated criminal psychology. Highways provided anonymity, quick escape routes, reduced likelihood of witnesses, and victims who were often traveling alone and unlikely to be missed immediately. This represented strategic thinking rather than opportunistic violence. The psychological profile of her ideal victim also became clear during this period. She targeted middle-aged white men who were seeking prostitutes, often while traveling for business. These men represented perfect victims because they combined maximum vulnerability with minimum risk of investigation. These victims were psychologically perfect for Aileen because they embodied everything she hated about male sexuality and power. They were men with resources and social status who were using their advantages to exploit women they viewed as disposable. In her mind, their deaths were justified revenge against systematic male oppression. The psychological concept of symbolic victimization explains how serial killers often choose victims who represent broader categories of people they hate or blame for their suffering. Eileen's victims weren't just individual men but symbols of every man who had ever hurt her. Her second murder of David Spears in June 1990 demonstrated the psychological evolution that had occurred since Mallory's death. This killing was more confident, efficient, and coldly calculated than the first, indicating that she had successfully integrated murder into her psychological toolkit. The 6-month gap between her first and second murders reflects the natural cooling-off period that characterizes serial killing behavior. During this time, the psychological pressure for violence builds gradually until it reaches a threshold that triggers the next killing episode. The psychological pressure for subsequent murders comes from multiple sources. The fading psychological high from previous killings, increasing confidence in her ability to kill and evade consequences, and the addictive nature of the absolute power and control that murder provides. The killing of David Spears also revealed the development of her murder ritual, the specific sequence of behaviors that surrounded each killing. These rituals provide psychological comfort and control for serial killers, creating predictable patterns that enhance their sense of mastery over their crimes. Her ritual began with the selection and approach of victims, continued through the negotiation of services and location selection, and culminated in the murder itself, followed by robbery and disposal of evidence. Each element of this ritual served important psychological functions. The robbery component of her crimes wasn't primarily motivated by financial need but by psychological domination. Taking the victim's possessions represented complete conquest, not just ending their life but claiming everything they owned as trophies of her victory. The psychological concept of trophy taking is common among serial killers who seek to maintain psychological connection to their crimes. Eileen's theft of cars, money, and personal items served as tangible reminders of her power and control over her victims. Her third murder, of Charles Carskadden in June 1990, occurred just 6 days after killing Spears, indicating an acceleration in her killing pattern. This rapid succession suggests that the psychological satisfaction from individual murders was diminishing, requiring more frequent killings to achieve the same emotional effect. The accelerating pattern also indicates increasing psychological confidence and decreased fear of consequences. Having successfully killed and evaded capture twice, Aileen's assessment of risk versus reward had shifted dramatically in favor of continued killing. The psychological concept of escalation in serial killing behavior explains how successful crimes lead to increased frequency and often increased violence. Each successful murder reduces psychological barriers to future killings while increasing the killer's confidence and sense of invulnerability. Her fourth victim, Troy Burris, was killed in July 1990, maintaining the accelerated pace and demonstrating the complete psychological transformation from her first tentative murder to confident, routine killing. The psychological evolution was complete. Murder had become a normal part of her survival strategy. The selection of Burris also revealed her evolving victim criteria. He was a truck driver, representing her expansion from targeting business travelers to include other categories of men who traveled highways alone. This broadening of victim types indicates increasing psychological confidence and sophistication. The psychological analysis of her victim selection reveals a sophisticated understanding of vulnerability and risk. She avoided men who appeared physically formidable, those who seemed likely to be missed quickly, and situations where witnesses or evidence might complicate her escape. Her ability to accurately assess victim vulnerability demonstrates the predatory intelligence that had developed through decades of survival in dangerous environments. The same skills that had kept her alive as a prostitute now enabled her to identify and exploit weakness in potential murder victims. The psychological transformation of her client interactions also became evident during this period. What had once been genuine prostitution transactions became elaborate deceptions designed to isolate and position victims for murder. She was no longer a prostitute who occasionally killed, but a killer who used prostitution as a hunting strategy. The psychological concept of predatory mimicry explains how killers can disguise their true intentions by appearing to engage in normal, non-threatening behaviors. Aileen's prostitution work became a perfect cover for identifying, accessing, and isolating potential victims. Her fifth murder of Dick Humphreys in September 1990 demonstrated complete mastery of her killing methodology. The crime was executed with cold efficiency, suggesting that murder had become psychologically routine rather than emotionally charged. The increasing psychological ease with which she committed murders indicates the complete erosion of normal moral constraints and emotional responses to extreme violence. What had once required significant psychological preparation now required no more thought than any other daily activity. The psychological concept of moral numbing explains how repeated exposure to extreme violence can eliminate normal emotional and moral responses. Aileen's psychology had adapted to murder as a normal behavior, removing the psychological barriers that prevent most people from killing. Her sixth victim, Walter Gino Antonio, was killed in November 1990, continuing the pattern of accelerating violence and psychological deterioration. By this point, murder had become so psychologically routine that it provided diminishing emotional rewards, leading to potential for even more extreme violence. The diminishing psychological returns from murder created a dangerous dynamic where increasingly frequent or violent killings might be required to achieve the same emotional satisfaction. This pattern often leads serial killers to escalate their violence or change their methodology to recapture the psychological high of their early crimes. Her final murder, of Peter Seams in June 1991, represented the culmination of her killing spree and the peak of her psychological evolution as a serial killer. By this point, she had developed complete confidence in her ability to kill and evade consequences, leading to the carelessness that would ultimately result in her capture. The psychological profile that emerges from analysis of her victim selection and killing pattern reveals a sophisticated predator who had completely adapted to murder as a survival and empowerment strategy. Her crimes weren't impulsive acts of violence, but calculated executions carried out by someone who had psychologically evolved beyond normal moral constraints. The systematic nature of her victim selection, the consistency of her methodology, and the psychological ease with which she committed multiple murders demonstrate the complete transformation from abuse victim to serial predator. The damaged child had become one of history's most efficient and psychologically complex killers. The relationship between Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore represents one of the most psychologically complex aspects of this case, demonstrating how even the most damaged and dangerous individuals can maintain capacity for genuine emotional attachment while simultaneously engaging in serial murder. Understanding this relationship is crucial because it reveals the psychological compartmentalization that enabled Aileen to function as both a loving partner and a calculated killer. Aileen met Tyria Moore in a gay bar in Daytona Beach in 1986. 3 years before her first murder. This timing is psychologically significant because it means their relationship developed during the crucial period when Aileen's psychology was evolving from general violence toward the specific mindset that would enable serial killing. For Aileen, the relationship with Tyria represented something she had never experienced before: genuine emotional connection without exploitation, abuse, or transaction. This was psychologically revolutionary for someone whose entire understanding of relationships had been built on survival, exploitation, and violence. The psychological impact of experiencing authentic affection for the first time at age 30 cannot be overstated. Aileen had lived 3 decades without ever forming a healthy emotional bond with another person. Her relationship with Tyria awakened psychological capacities that had been dormant or damaged since early childhood. Tyria Moore was 24 years old when they met, 7 years younger than Aileen, and came from a dramatically different background. Unlike Aileen, Tyria had experienced relatively normal family relationships and social development, making her psychologically stable in ways that Aileen found both fascinating and threatening. The psychological dynamics of their early relationship reveal Aileen's desperate hunger for genuine human connection combined with her complete inability to understand or maintain healthy relationship boundaries. Having never experienced normal love, she approached the relationship with the intensity and desperation of someone who had been emotionally starved for decades. For Tyria, Aileen initially represented excitement, adventure, and escape from the conventional life she had known. Aileen's intensity, street experience, and dangerous edge provided psychological stimulation that Tyria found compelling, at least in the beginning of their relationship. The psychological concept of trauma bonding helps explain the initial attraction between these two very different women. Tyria was drawn to Aileen's damaged intensity, while Aileen was desperate for Tyria's emotional stability and capacity for genuine affection. Their relationship quickly became characterized by extreme psychological dependency, with Aileen viewing Tyria as her sole source of emotional validation and human connection. This level of dependency was psychologically unhealthy, but understandable given Aileen's history of complete isolation and abandonment. The financial dynamic of their relationship became psychologically crucial to understanding how Aileen's murders were motivated and sustained. Tyria became financially dependent on Aileen's prostitution income, creating a psychological framework where Aileen's criminal activities served the dual purpose of survival and relationship maintenance. This financial dependency created what psychologists call a codependent dynamic where both women needed each other in unhealthy ways. Aileen needed Tyria's emotional validation, while Tyria needed Eileen's financial support, creating a relationship built on mutual exploitation disguised as love. The psychological pressure of supporting Tyria financially while maintaining their relationship became one of the driving forces behind Eileen's escalating criminal behavior. The murders weren't just about personal empowerment or revenge, they were also about providing for the only person who had ever shown her genuine affection. When Aileen began killing in 1989, 3 years into their relationship, the psychological dynamics became extraordinarily complex. She was simultaneously experiencing genuine love for the first time while committing the ultimate acts of violence against strangers who represented categories of people she hated. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain both loving partnership and serial murder reveals the sophisticated dissociative mechanisms that Aileen had developed through decades of trauma. She could be tender, caring, and emotionally vulnerable with Tyria while being calculatingly violent with her victims. This compartmentalization was enabled by the fact that Tyria represented everything positive about human connection, while Eileen's victims represented everything negative about male exploitation. In her mind, these were completely separate psychological categories requiring completely different responses. The murders actually intensified certain aspects of Eileen's relationship with Tyria because they provided the financial resources necessary to maintain their lifestyle and relationship. The stolen cars, money, and goods from victims enabled them to live more comfortably than Eileen's prostitution income alone would have allowed. Psychologically, the murders became Eileen's way of providing for and protecting her relationship with Tyria. In her distorted thinking, killing exploitative men was serving the dual purpose of eliminating threats to women while generating resources for the woman she loved. The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance explains how Aileen could simultaneously view herself as a loving partner and a justified killer. The murders weren't inconsistent with her love for Tyria, they were expressions of that love, protecting and providing for the relationship she valued above all else. Tyria's gradual awareness of Eileen's criminal activities created enormous psychological tension within their relationship. While she may not have initially known about the murders, she certainly became aware that Aileen was engaging in increasingly dangerous and lucrative criminal behavior. The psychological dynamics of willful ignorance became central to their relationship as it evolved. Tyria benefited financially from Eileen's crimes while maintaining plausible deniability about their exact nature. This allowed her to enjoy the benefits while avoiding psychological responsibility for the consequences. This willful ignorance created psychological stress for both women. Aileen desperately wanted to share the full truth of her activities with the person she loved most, while Tyria desperately wanted to avoid knowing information that would force her to make difficult moral choices about their relationship. The psychological isolation that Aileen experienced as a serial killer was partially alleviated by her relationship with Tyria, but it was also intensified by her inability to share the most significant aspect of her life. She was simultaneously more connected and more isolated than she had ever been. The murders themselves became psychologically easier for Aileen because she could frame them as acts of service to Tyria rather than simply expressions of personal rage or empowerment. This gave her crimes additional psychological justification and made them feel less selfish or purely violent. The psychological concept of altruistic violence explains how people can commit extreme acts while viewing themselves as serving others rather than satisfying personal needs. Eileen's murders became psychologically reframed as providing for and protecting Tyria, rather than simply expressing her own damaged psychology. As their relationship progressed and Eileen's killing spree continued, the psychological strain began to show in both women. Tyria became increasingly nervous and suspicious about Eileen's activities. while Aileen became increasingly desperate to maintain the relationship that had become her only source of emotional stability. The psychological pressure of maintaining a loving relationship while concealing multiple murders created enormous internal stress for Aileen. The compartmentalization that enabled her criminal behavior also prevented her from achieving true intimacy with the person she loved most. Tyria's growing discomfort with their lifestyle and Eileen's criminal activities created relationship conflicts that Aileen interpreted as threats to her only source of emotional connection. This made her increasingly desperate and potentially more dangerous as she sought to maintain the relationship at any cost. The psychological dependency that characterized their relationship meant that any threat to their connection represented an existential crisis. For Aileen, losing Tyria would mean returning to the complete emotional isolation that had characterized her entire life before their relationship. The murders continued partly because they had become Eileen's primary method of maintaining the financial stability necessary for their relationship. Stopping the killings would have meant returning to simple prostitution income, which might not have been sufficient to support their lifestyle and keep Tyria satisfied. The psychological concept of behavioral entrapment explains how criminal behavior can become self-perpetuating when it serves multiple psychological and practical functions. Eileen's murders served her need for empowerment, revenge, and financial support simultaneously, making them psychologically difficult to stop. The relationship with Tyria also provided psychological cover for Eileen's criminal activities. Having a loving partner made her feel more normal and less like the dangerous predator she had become. The relationship allowed her to maintain some connection to conventional human experience despite her extreme criminal behavior. The psychological complexity of loving someone while concealing multiple murders from them created internal conflicts that began to affect Eileen's mental stability. The stress of maintaining this deception while desperately needing emotional intimacy created psychological pressures that contributed to her eventual capture. Tyria's ultimate cooperation with law enforcement represented the final betrayal in a life characterized by abandonment and exploitation. For Aileen, this betrayal was particularly devastating because it came from the only person who had ever provided genuine emotional connection. The psychological impact of Tyria's betrayal cannot be overstated. It confirmed Eileen's deepest fears about human relationships and validated her belief that everyone would ultimately abandon or exploit her. This betrayal destroyed her last connection to anything resembling normal human emotion. The relationship with Tyria reveals the tragic psychological complexity of Eileen's character, her capacity for genuine love coexisting with her ability to commit calculated murder. This duality makes her one of the most psychologically fascinating and disturbing figures in criminal history. The fact that Aileen could maintain a loving relationship while simultaneously committing serial murder demonstrates the sophisticated psychological compartmentalization that extreme trauma can create. She was simultaneously the most dangerous and most vulnerable person in any room. Understanding this relationship is crucial because it reveals that even the most damaged and dangerous individuals retain capacity for human connection. Eileen's love for Tyria was genuine, even though it coexisted with her ability to kill strangers without remorse. The psychological lesson of their relationship is that love and violence can coexist in the same person when trauma has created sufficient psychological compartmentalization. Eileen's capacity for both tenderness and murder represents the ultimate expression of how childhood trauma can fragment human psychology into seemingly incompatible elements. As law enforcement began connecting the murders along Florida's highways in late 1990 and early 1991, Aileen entered a psychological state characterized by increasing paranoia. deteriorating mental stability, and the gradual breakdown of the compartmentalization that had enabled her to function as both a loving partner and a serial killer. Understanding her psychological response to investigation pressure reveals crucial insights into how her damaged mind processed threats to her freedom and relationship. The initial law enforcement response to the highway murders was hampered by jurisdictional issues and the unusual nature of a female serial killer targeting male victims. This delay in recognizing the pattern gave Aileen a false sense of security that reinforced her belief in her own criminal sophistication and invulnerability to consequences. The psychological concept of criminal overconfidence explains how successful crimes can lead perpetrators to underestimate law enforcement capabilities and overestimate their own criminal skills. Eileen's initial success in evading detection created dangerous psychological assumptions about her ability to continue killing without consequences. When the investigation began to intensify and connections between the murders became public knowledge, Eileen's psychological response revealed the underlying anxiety and paranoia that had always characterized her mental state. The hypervigilance that had enabled her survival now became focused on detecting and avoiding law enforcement. The media attention surrounding the case created additional psychological pressure because it transformed Aileen from an anonymous predator into a public figure. The knowledge that she was being actively hunted by multiple law enforcement agencies fundamentally altered her psychological relationship to her crimes and her environment. The psychological impact of becoming the subject of a manhunt cannot be overstated for someone with Eileen's trauma history and attachment to control. Having spent her entire life feeling powerless, the period of successful killing had provided unprecedented psychological empowerment. The investigation threatened to return her to a state of powerlessness and victimization. Her response to increasing law enforcement pressure revealed the depth of her psychological dependency on Tyria and the relationship that had become her only source of emotional stability. Rather than considering flight or surrender, her primary concern became protecting their relationship and continuing to provide financially for Tyria. The psychological concept of attachment override explains how strong emotional bonds can cause individuals to make irrational decisions that prioritize relationship maintenance over personal safety. Eileen's attachment to Tyria was so psychologically central that she couldn't conceive of survival without their relationship. As the investigation closed in, Eileen's behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid, but also more reckless. The psychological pressure of maintaining her criminal activities while protecting her relationship with Tyria created internal conflicts that began to affect her judgment and decision-making capabilities. The murder of Peter Seams in June 1991, her final killing, demonstrated both her psychological deterioration and her increasing desperation to maintain the financial resources necessary for her relationship with Tyria. This murder was less carefully planned and executed than her previous crimes, indicating declining psychological stability. The aftermath of the Seams murder proved to be Eileen's undoing because she and Tyria were witnessed abandoning his car after a traffic accident. This witness's testimony provided law enforcement with their first solid leads connecting the murders to specific individuals, marking the beginning of the end of Eileen's killing spree. The psychological impact of being identified and described by witnesses represented a fundamental shift in Eileen's relationship to her crimes. She was no longer an invisible predator, but a known suspect whose description was circulating among law enforcement agencies throughout Florida. This identification created what psychologists call persecution anxiety, a psychological state characterized by constant fear of detection and capture. For someone with Eileen's trauma history and need for control, this anxiety was particularly devastating because it returned her to the powerless state she had spent her life trying to escape. The increasing law enforcement pressure also revealed the psychological fragility of her relationship with Tyria. As the investigation intensified, Tyria became increasingly nervous and distant, threatening the emotional foundation that had sustained Aileen through her killing spree. The psychological concept of stress deterioration explains how extreme pressure can cause the breakdown of psychological coping mechanisms that normally enable functioning. As investigation pressure mounted, Eileen's ability to maintain the compartmentalization between her criminal activities and her emotional life began to collapse. Her drinking escalated dramatically during this period as she attempted to cope with the psychological stress of being hunted while watching her relationship with Tyria deteriorate. Alcohol became her primary method of managing the anxiety and paranoia that were overwhelming her psychological defenses. The combination of investigation pressure, relationship stress, and increased alcohol consumption created a psychological perfect storm that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. Aileen was operating in a state of chronic panic disguised as defiant confidence. The psychological deterioration was also evident in her increasing inability to assess risk accurately. Decisions that should have been obvious, such as leaving Florida or ending the relationship to protect Tyria, became psychologically impossible because they threatened her core emotional needs. The development of what law enforcement termed person of interest status created additional psychological pressure because it formalized Eileen's transition from anonymous criminal to identified suspect. This change represented a fundamental threat to her psychological sense of control and invisibility. Her response to being actively hunted revealed the deep-seated persecution complex that had developed through decades of systematic abuse and social rejection. In her mind, law enforcement represented just another form of male authority seeking to victimize and control her. The psychological concept of authority paranoia explains how individuals with histories of institutional abuse often perceive law enforcement as just another form of predator rather than as agents of justice. For Aileen, police represented the same male dominance and control that had characterized all of her abusive relationships. As the investigation intensified, Eileen's protective instincts toward Tyria became increasingly desperate and irrational. She began making decisions based solely on protecting Tyria from investigation rather than protecting herself from capture, demonstrating the complete psychological prioritization of their relationship. The psychological pressure also triggered increased violence and aggression in her daily interactions. Witnesses from this period describe someone who was increasingly hostile, paranoid, and quick to resort to threats or violence when feeling cornered or challenged. This escalating aggression indicated that the psychological compartmentalization that had enabled her to function normally while committing murders was breaking down. The controlled violence of her killing spree was beginning to bleed into all areas of her life. The media portrayal of the case as involving a female serial killer created additional psychological pressure because it challenged conventional assumptions about women and violence. Aileen became aware that she was being viewed as a psychological anomaly, which both fascinated and disturbed her. The psychological impact of becoming a media sensation was complex for someone who had spent her entire life feeling invisible and worthless. The attention was simultaneously validating and terrifying, providing the recognition she had always craved while threatening the freedom she needed to continue her criminal activities. Her increasing paranoia began to focus on perceived betrayals by people in her immediate environment. Everyone became a potential informant or threat, creating a psychological state where trust became impossible and isolation increased despite her desperate need for human connection. The psychological concept of paranoid deterioration describes how extreme stress can cause individuals to lose the ability to distinguish between real and imagined threats. Eileen's capacity for accurate threat assessment, which had been crucial to her criminal success, began to fail under investigation pressure. The relationship with Tyria became increasingly strained as law enforcement pressure mounted. Tyria's growing nervousness and desire to distance herself from Eileen's criminal activities represented the ultimate threat to Eileen's psychological stability and emotional foundation. Eileen's response to Tyria's increasing distance was to become more demanding, controlling, and desperate in her attempts to maintain their relationship. This desperation drove her to take increasingly dangerous risks to continue providing financially for Tyria through criminal activities. The psychological dynamics of their relationship during this period revealed the toxic codependency that had developed. Eileen's entire sense of self-worth had become dependent on maintaining Tyria's affection and presence, making any threat to their relationship an existential crisis. The investigation also revealed Eileen's complete lack of practical criminal sophistication. Despite her psychological adaptation to murder, her attempts to evade detection were amateurish and often counterproductive, indicating that her criminal success had been due more to luck and victim selection than to actual criminal skill. The psychological pressure of being hunted while trying to maintain a relationship created internal conflicts that manifested as increasingly erratic behavior. Aileen was simultaneously trying to be a loving partner and a fugitive serial killer, roles that became psychologically incompatible under pressure. Her drinking during this period reached levels that interfered with her judgment and self-preservation instincts. The alcohol that had once helped her cope with trauma was now preventing her from making rational decisions about her survival and freedom. The psychological deterioration was also evident in her increasing inability to control her temper and aggression. The careful emotional regulation that had enabled her to appear normal while committing murders was breaking down under the stress of investigation pressure. The final weeks before her capture were characterized by a psychological state that combined desperation, paranoia, alcohol abuse, and relationship crisis. Aileen was operating in a state of chronic panic that made rational decision-making impossible while still attempting to maintain the facade of normal relationship functioning. The investigation pressure had successfully broken down the psychological compartmentalization that had enabled Aileen to function as both killer and lover. Under extreme stress, the carefully maintained boundaries between these aspects of her psychology collapsed, leading to the behavioral deterioration that would ultimately result in her capture. The psychological lesson of this period is that even the most sophisticated criminal psychology can be undermined by emotional attachment and investigation pressure. Eileen's downfall came not from criminal mistakes, but from her inability to abandon the relationship that had become more important to her than her freedom or survival. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at the Last Resort Bar in Port Orange, Florida, on an outstanding warrant for firearms violations. This moment marked the end of her killing spree and the beginning of a new psychological phase characterized by the complete collapse of her carefully constructed survival mechanisms and the emergence of behaviors that would define her final years. The arrest itself was psychologically significant because it occurred in a location where Aileen felt safe and among people she considered allies. Being captured in what she perceived as a sanctuary represented a fundamental breach of her psychological defenses and confirmed her deepest fears about the impossibility of true safety or security. Her initial response to arrest revealed the sophisticated psychological compartmentalization she had developed through decades of trauma and criminal activity. Despite being wanted for multiple murders, she was initially detained only on weapons charges, allowing her to maintain the pretense that this was a minor legal issue rather than the beginning of her downfall. The psychological concept of denial maintenance explains how individuals can continue to minimize threats even when facing overwhelming evidence of their danger. Eileen's initial behavior in custody suggested she believed she could manage this situation, like countless previous arrests throughout her criminal career. However, the psychological reality of her situation was fundamentally different from her previous incarcerations. This wasn't a brief detention for prostitution or minor crimes. but the beginning of a murder investigation that would threaten her with execution. The stakes were higher than anything she had ever faced. The separation from Tyria that resulted from her arrest represented the ultimate psychological catastrophe for someone whose entire emotional stability had become dependent on that relationship. Being cut off from her only source of human connection while facing potential death sentences created psychological pressures that her damaged mind couldn't process. Her behavior during the initial interrogations revealed the complex psychology of someone who was simultaneously desperate to maintain innocence while also craving recognition for her crimes. This psychological contradiction would characterize much of her behavior throughout the legal process. The psychological concept of confession ambivalence describes the internal conflict between self-preservation and the need for acknowledgement that many criminals experience when confronted with their crimes. For Aileen, this conflict was intensified by her desperate need for human connection and understanding. The interrogation techniques used by law enforcement were particularly effective against someone with Aileen's psychological profile. Her history of abandonment and desperate need for human connection made her vulnerable to investigators who showed interest in her story and appeared to offer understanding rather than judgment. The gradual revelation that Tyria was cooperating with law enforcement represented the ultimate betrayal for someone whose entire psychological foundation had been built on their relationship. Learning that the person she loved most was helping to build the case against her shattered her remaining psychological defenses. This betrayal by Tyria triggered what psychologists call psychological decompensation, the complete breakdown of coping mechanisms that had enabled previous functioning. The discovery that her only source of love and connection was working against her destroyed her ability to maintain psychological stability. Her response to this betrayal revealed the depth of her attachment trauma and abandonment issues. Rather than anger or hatred toward Tyria, her initial response was desperate attempts to protect and excuse her, demonstrating the toxic loyalty that characterizes many trauma-bonded relationships. The psychological dynamics of her interrogations became increasingly complex as investigators learned to exploit her need for human connection and her desperate desire to protect Tyria. They offered her the attention and interest she craved while gradually building evidence for her prosecution. Her first confession came not from a desire to accept responsibility, but from psychological manipulation that convinced her she could protect Tyria by admitting to the crimes. This demonstrates how her emotional attachments continued to override her survival instincts even when facing potential execution. The psychological concept of protective confession explains how individuals can admit to crimes primarily to shield others from consequences rather than from genuine remorse or desire for justice. Aileen's confessions were motivated more by love for Tyria than by acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The detailed nature of her confessions revealed both her psychological need for attention and her complete lack of genuine remorse for her victims. She provided extensive details about the murders while showing no emotional connection to the suffering she had caused. This absence of empathy for her victims while maintaining intense emotional connection to Tyria demonstrates the selective emotional capacity that characterizes many individuals with severe personality disorders. She was capable of deep feeling, but only toward those she perceived as extensions of herself. Her behavior in jail during the initial period of detention revealed the psychological impact of forced sobriety after years of chronic alcohol abuse. Without her primary coping mechanism, she was forced to confront the reality of her situation and her crimes without chemical numbing. The withdrawal from alcohol, combined with the stress of incarceration and separation from Tyria, created a psychological state characterized by intense anxiety, depression, and emotional volatility. Her mood swings became extreme and unpredictable, alarming even experienced correctional staff. The psychological concept of institutional adaptation describes how individuals adjust their behavior to survive in correctional environments. For Aileen, This adaptation was complicated by her history of institutional abuse and her perception of authority figures as threats rather than protectors. Her interactions with correctional staff revealed the deep-seated authority issues that had developed through decades of abuse by male authority figures. She viewed guards, administrators, and other officials as potential predators rather than as neutral professionals doing their jobs. The psychological dynamics of her relationship with other inmates were complex and often volatile. Her reputation as a serial killer gave her a certain status within the jail hierarchy, but her emotional instability and aggressive tendencies made genuine connections difficult. Her attempts to maintain psychological control in an environment designed to remove all control created constant conflicts with institutional rules and procedures. The same need for dominance that had driven her murders now manifested as defiance of correctional authority. The media attention surrounding her case created additional psychological pressures because it transformed her from an anonymous inmate into a celebrity criminal. This attention satisfied her lifelong need for recognition while also creating new anxieties about public perception and judgment. The psychological impact of becoming a famous criminal was complex for someone who had spent her entire life feeling invisible and worthless. The notoriety provided the attention she had always craved while also confirming her identity as fundamentally different from normal human beings. Her responses to psychological evaluations revealed the sophisticated defense mechanisms she had developed to cope with trauma, while also demonstrating the severe personality disorders that had resulted from her abusive childhood. She was simultaneously vulnerable and dangerous, damaged and calculating. The psychological concept of defensive grandiosity explains how individuals with severe trauma histories can develop inflated self-concepts as protection against feelings of worthlessness. Aileen's claims of superiority and special status served to defend against the crushing self-hatred that had developed through years of abuse. Her relationship with her legal representation was complicated by her inability to trust authority figures and her desperate need for human connection. She simultaneously needed their help while viewing them as potential betrayers who might abandon her like everyone else in her life. The psychological dynamics of preparing for trial while facing potential execution created enormous stress for someone with Aileen's trauma history and abandonment issues. The prospect of death represented the ultimate abandonment, being rejected not just by individuals, but by society itself. Her behavior during legal proceedings revealed the complex psychology of someone who was simultaneously seeking death as an escape from psychological pain while also fighting for survival through legal appeals. This contradiction would characterize much of her behavior throughout the trial process. The psychological concept of death wish ambivalence describes the internal conflict between survival instincts and the desire for relief from unbearable psychological pain. Aileen's relationship with her potential execution was characterized by this fundamental ambivalence. Her statements to the media during this period revealed her desperate need for understanding and validation, even from strangers. She craved recognition of her suffering and acknowledgement that her crimes were justified responses to the abuse she had endured. The psychological isolation of being a notorious criminal in protective custody created additional mental health challenges. She was simultaneously famous and completely alone, recognized by millions, but connected to no one who genuinely cared about her welfare. Her attempts to maintain correspondence with supporters and advocates revealed her continued desperate need for human connection despite her crimes. Even brief letters or visits provided psychological lifelines that helped her cope with the overwhelming stress of her situation. The psychological deterioration evident during this period was accelerated by the combination of forced sobriety, institutional stress, separation from all meaningful relationships, and the prospect of execution. Her mental state became increasingly fragmented and unstable. Her relationship with mental health professionals was characterized by the same mistrust and manipulation that had defined all of her relationships with authority figures. She provided information strategically rather than honestly, viewing therapeutic interactions as potential threats rather than opportunities for help. The psychological concept of therapeutic resistance explains how individuals with severe trauma histories often resist genuine therapeutic engagement because vulnerability feels dangerous. Eileen's refusal to engage authentically with mental health treatment reflected her learned mistrust of anyone in positions of power. Her behavior during this period established patterns that would continue throughout her incarceration, alternating between desperate pleas for understanding and defiant rejection of authority, between claims of innocence and detailed confessions, between expressions of love for those who had betrayed her and hatred for those trying to help her. The psychological complexity of her responses to custody revealed the depth of damage created by her traumatic childhood and abusive life experiences. She was simultaneously a victim deserving of compassion and a predator who had committed terrible crimes, making appropriate responses to her situation nearly impossible for everyone involved. The transition from serial killer to infamous prisoner represented a fundamental shift in her psychological identity and social role. She was no longer a predator stalking highways, but a caged celebrity whose every word and action would be scrutinized by media, legal professionals, and the public. The trial proceedings of Aileen Wuornos revealed one of the most psychologically complex and disturbing courtroom behaviors in criminal justice history. Her conduct during legal proceedings demonstrated the complete breakdown of social functioning while simultaneously revealing the sophisticated manipulation skills she had developed through decades of survival in hostile environments. Understanding her trial psychology provides crucial insights into how severe trauma can manifest in formal legal settings. Eileen's first trial, for the murder of Richard Mallory, began in January 1992, exactly 1 year after her arrest. This timing was psychologically significant because it gave her a full year in custody to process the collapse of her previous life while building new psychological defense mechanisms suited to her changed circumstances. Her decision to represent herself during portions of the trial revealed both her pathological need for control and her complete misunderstanding of legal procedures and social norms. Having spent her entire life in situations where trusting others led to exploitation and abuse, she could not psychologically surrender control to defense attorneys, even when her life depended on their expertise. The psychological concept of learned mistrust explains why individuals with severe trauma histories often refuse help even when desperately needed. Eileen's refusal to cooperate with her legal team reflected decades of learning that other people would ultimately betray or abandon her when she was most vulnerable. Her courtroom behavior was characterized by dramatic mood swings, explosive outbursts, and attempts to control proceedings through intimidation and manipulation. These behaviors weren't simply stress responses, but sophisticated psychological strategies she had developed to manage threatening situations throughout her life. The psychological dynamics of her relationship with the judge, jury, and court personnel revealed her fundamental inability to recognize appropriate social boundaries or authority structures. She treated the courtroom like a street environment where dominance and aggression were necessary for survival. Her attempts to seduce, intimidate, or manipulate various court officials demonstrated the range of survival strategies she had developed through decades of exploitation and abuse. She instinctively assessed each person's vulnerabilities and attempted to exploit them for tactical advantage. The psychological concept of performative identity explains how individuals can adopt different personas for strategic purposes. Eileen shifted between victim, predator, and sympathetic figure depending on what she perceived as most advantageous in each moment. Her testimony during the trial revealed the complex psychological relationship she had developed with her own crimes. She simultaneously claimed innocence, justified her actions as self-defense, and provided detailed descriptions of the murders that demonstrated clear premeditation and calculation. This psychological contradiction between claiming innocence and revealing guilty knowledge created enormous problems for her defense team. Her need to be understood and recognized as justified in her actions conflicted with the legal necessity of maintaining innocence claims. The psychological concept of cognitive compartmentalization helps explain how she could maintain contradictory beliefs about her actions. In one psychological compartment, she was an innocent victim defending herself. In another, she was a justified killer eliminating predators. In a third, she was a strategic criminal who had successfully evaded detection. Her interactions with the media during the trial revealed her desperate need for public understanding and validation. She craved recognition that her crimes were justified responses to the systematic abuse she had endured, seeking vindication from strangers when none came from the legal system. The psychological dynamics of seeking validation from media and public attention while simultaneously facing execution created additional mental stress. She needed recognition of her suffering while also needing to appear stable enough to avoid death sentences. Her relationship with her defense attorneys was characterized by the same patterns of initial idealization followed by inevitable disappointment and rage that had characterized all of her relationships. She expected them to provide perfect understanding and protection while simultaneously sabotaging their efforts to help her. The psychological concept of splitting describes the tendency to view others as either completely good or completely bad without recognizing complexity or ambiguity. Aileen's view of her attorneys shifted rapidly between seeing them as saviors and viewing them as betrayers. Her courtroom outbursts often occurred when she felt misunderstood or misrepresented, revealing the depth of her need for accurate recognition of her experiences and motivations. Being characterized incorrectly was more psychologically threatening than facing potential execution. The psychological investment she had in being understood as a victim rather than a predator created conflicts with legal strategies that might have been more effective for avoiding death sentences. She prioritized psychological validation over legal survival. Her testimony about the murders revealed the sophisticated psychological justifications she had developed for her crimes. Each killing was reframed as necessary self-defense against male predators who deserved to die for their exploitation of women. This psychological reframing wasn't simply courtroom strategy, but genuine belief that had developed through years of rationalizing her behavior. She truly believed that her murders were justified acts of protection and revenge rather than expressions of her own predatory psychology. The psychological concept of moral licensing explains how individuals can justify extreme behaviors by framing them as serving higher moral purposes. Aileen's murders became psychologically acceptable because they were protecting other women from male predation. Her descriptions of the crime scenes and victim behavior revealed both her predatory intelligence and her complete lack of empathy for the men she had killed. She could provide detailed accounts of their fear and suffering without showing any emotional connection to their humanity. The absence of genuine remorse during her testimony was particularly disturbing to observers because it demonstrated the complete psychological dehumanization of her victims. They weren't people who had suffered and died, but objects that had been appropriately eliminated. Her attempts to manipulate jury sympathy by emphasizing her traumatic childhood were psychologically calculated rather than emotionally genuine. She had learned to use her victimization as a tool for gaining advantage rather than as a path toward healing or understanding. The psychological concept of strategic victimization describes how individuals can weaponize their own trauma experiences to manipulate others rather than seeking genuine healing. Eileen's childhood abuse became a courtroom strategy rather than a path toward rehabilitation. Her behavior toward prosecution witnesses revealed her continuing need to dominate and control potential threats. She attempted to intimidate witnesses through staring, verbal threats, and demonstrations of her capacity for violence. The psychological dynamics of facing her victims' families during court proceedings created additional stress because it forced her to confront the human consequences of her actions. Her response was typically to dehumanize the families rather than acknowledge their suffering. Her relationship with court-appointed mental health professionals was characterized by manipulation and resistance rather than genuine cooperation. She viewed psychological evaluations as battles to be won rather than opportunities for understanding or treatment. The psychological concept of diagnostic resistance explains how individuals with severe personality disorders often resist accurate psychological assessment because it threatens their carefully constructed self-narratives. Aileen fought against any diagnosis that would characterize her as mentally ill rather than morally justified. Her inconsistent statements about her mental state revealed the sophisticated psychological game playing she employed to manage different audiences. She could appear insane when it served her purposes, while demonstrating clear rational thinking when needed for legal strategy. The trial publicity created additional psychological pressures because it made her a public figure whose every word and action were scrutinized by media and public opinion. This attention satisfied her need for recognition while also creating new anxieties about perception and judgment. Her responses to expert testimony about her psychological condition revealed her fundamental resistance to being understood or categorized by mental health professionals. She rejected any characterization that would diminish her agency or suggest that her crimes resulted from mental illness rather than moral choice. The psychological concept of competency performance describes how individuals can appear mentally competent for legal purposes while actually suffering from severe psychological disorders. Eileen's ability to participate in her defense masked the depth of her psychological damage. Her sentencing phase behavior revealed the ultimate expression of her psychological contradictions. She simultaneously sought death as an escape from psychological pain while also fighting against it as the ultimate rejection and abandonment. The psychological dynamics of facing execution while craving death created internal conflicts that manifested as erratic and contradictory courtroom behavior. She wanted to control the manner and timing of her death while also fighting against society's right to impose it. Her final statements during sentencing revealed the complete psychological breakdown of someone who had spent decades building defense mechanisms against abandonment and rejection. Facing the ultimate abandonment execution by society itself, she could no longer maintain psychological coherence. The trial proceedings demonstrated how severe childhood trauma can create individuals who are simultaneously deserving of compassion and legally responsible for horrific crimes. Eileen's courtroom behavior revealed both the victim she had been and the predator she had become. Her psychological responses to legal proceedings showed the complete failure of the justice system to address the underlying trauma that had created her criminal behavior. The adversarial legal process was designed to determine guilt rather than understand or treat the psychological damage that had produced her crimes. The ultimate psychological tragedy of her trials was that they provided neither justice for her victims nor healing for her damaged psyche. They became public spectacles that satisfied societal need for retribution while failing to address the systematic failures that had created such a dangerous individual. Her trial behavior established her as one of the most psychologically complex defendants in criminal justice history, someone who was simultaneously manipulative and genuine, calculating and damaged. responsible, and victimized. Understanding her courtroom psychology provides crucial insights into how extreme trauma can manifest in formal legal settings. Aileen Wuornos spent over a decade on death row before her execution on October 9, 2002, a period that revealed the final psychological evolution of one of history's most complex serial killers. Her behavior during these final years demonstrated how extreme trauma, institutional isolation, and the prospect of state-sanctioned death can transform even the most damaged individuals into something beyond conventional psychological understanding. The transition from trial defendant to death row inmate represented a fundamental shift in Aileen's psychological reality. No longer fighting for her life in courtrooms, she was forced to confront the reality of her inevitable execution while existing in the most restrictive and isolating environment imaginable for someone with severe abandonment trauma. Her initial years on death row were characterized by continued appeals, media interviews, and attempts to maintain some connection to the outside world. However, the psychological impact of prolonged isolation and the certainty of eventual execution began to erode whatever stability she had maintained during the trial period. The psychological concept of death row syndrome describes the mental deterioration that often occurs in individuals facing execution after prolonged periods of isolation and uncertainty. For Aileen, whose psychology was already severely damaged by decades of trauma, this environment accelerated her psychological breakdown. Her relationship with her legal team during the appeals process revealed the same patterns of idealization, disappointment, and rage that had characterized all of her relationships. She expected perfect advocacy while simultaneously sabotaging their efforts through erratic behavior and contradictory statements. The psychological dynamics of maintaining hope for life while preparing for death created internal conflicts that manifested as extreme mood swings, paranoid ideation, and increasingly bizarre behavior. She existed in a constant state of psychological limbo that prevented any form of emotional stability or peace. Her media interviews during this period became increasingly erratic and contradictory, revealing the progressive deterioration of her mental state under the stress of prolonged death row confinement. She alternately claimed innocence, confessed to additional murders, and demanded immediate execution. The psychological concept of institutional psychosis explains how prolonged confinement in restrictive environments can create or exacerbate existing mental illness. Aileen's behavior during her final years showed clear signs of psychotic thinking and reality distortion. Her interactions with other death row inmates were limited by the isolation protocols of maximum security confinement, but the few documented interactions revealed her continued need for human connection despite her dangerous and unpredictable behavior. The psychological isolation of death row was particularly devastating for someone with Aileen's attachment, trauma, and abandonment issues. Being cut off from meaningful human contact while facing execution represented the ultimate form of rejection and abandonment she had always feared. Her correspondence with supporters, journalists, and curiosity seekers became her primary connection to the outside world. These letters revealed both her desperate need for human contact and her continued attempts to control her narrative and public perception. The psychological concept of narrative control explains how individuals facing death often become obsessed with controlling how they will be remembered. Aileen's final years were characterized by frantic attempts to shape public understanding of her crimes and motivations. Her claims of additional murders that she had never committed revealed the complete breakdown of the boundary between reality and fantasy that characterizes severe mental illness. She began confessing to crimes that were physically impossible or contradicted by clear evidence. This pattern of false confessions wasn't motivated by guilt or desire for accuracy, but by psychological need for attention and significance. Each new claim generated media coverage and human contact that temporarily relieved her psychological isolation. Her relationship with documentary filmmakers and journalists became increasingly important as traditional legal and family relationships disappeared. These professional interactions provided her only sustained human contact while also feeding her need for recognition and understanding. The psychological dynamics of being studied and documented while dying created additional stress because it transformed her into a specimen rather than a person. She was simultaneously the subject of intense interest and completely abandoned by genuine human connection. Her religious conversions and spiritual claims during her final years reflected desperate attempts to find meaning and connection in the face of approaching death. However, these spiritual expressions were often contradictory and appeared more strategic than genuine. The psychological concept of deathbed conversion describes how facing execution can trigger spiritual seeking as individuals attempt to find meaning or redemption in their final moments. Aileen's religious expressions were complicated by her lifelong mistrust of authority figures and institutions. Her increasingly bizarre public statements and conspiracy theories revealed the complete deterioration of her ability to process reality accurately. She claimed persecution by invisible forces, described impossible scenarios, and made accusations that demonstrated clear paranoid delusions. The psychological isolation combined with the certainty of execution created a mental state where reality became increasingly malleable. Without normal social interaction to provide reality testing, her perceptions became increasingly distorted and disconnected from factual circumstances. Her demands for immediate execution in her final years represented both a desire to escape psychological suffering and an attempt to maintain some control over the timing and circumstances of her death. She wanted to die on her own terms rather than according to the state's schedule. The psychological concept of execution ambivalence describes the complex relationship many death row inmates develop with their impending execution. They simultaneously fear and desire death, viewing it as both ultimate punishment and final relief from suffering. Her behavior toward correctional staff during her final years became increasingly hostile and unpredictable, reflecting her deteriorating mental state and her perception of all authority figures as threats. Even routine interactions became opportunities for conflict and confrontation. The psychological deterioration was accelerated by her refusal to take prescribed psychiatric medications, viewing them as attempts to control her mind rather than efforts to provide treatment. This medical non-compliance worsened her already severe mental health conditions. Her final interviews revealed someone who had become completely disconnected from conventional reality while maintaining enough cognitive function to understand her approaching execution. She existed in a psychological state that defied normal psychiatric categories. The psychological concept of terminal clarity sometimes occurs in individuals facing death, where brief moments of clear thinking emerge despite overall mental deterioration. Aileen's final statements showed occasional flashes of insight into her condition and circumstances. Her execution on October 9, 2002, marked the end of one of the most psychologically complex criminal careers in history. Her final words, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, Big Mothership and all, I'll be back," demonstrated the complete psychological breakdown that had occurred during her final years. The psychological analysis of her final statement reveals both delusional thinking and possible symbolic communication about her expectation of death and transformation. The science fiction references may have represented her attempt to maintain some control over the narrative of her death. Her execution generated significant psychological discussion about the ethics of executing individuals with severe mental illness and trauma histories. Legal and mental health professionals debated whether someone with her level of psychological damage could be held fully responsible for their actions. The psychological legacy of Aileen Wuornos extends far beyond her individual case to fundamental questions about trauma, responsibility, justice, and the possibility of redemption for severely damaged individuals. Her case continues to influence criminal psychology, legal practice, and social policy. The psychological lessons of her case include the devastating long-term consequences of childhood trauma, the failure of social institutions to protect vulnerable children, and the complex relationship between victimization and perpetration that can develop in severely abused individuals. Her case also demonstrates the limitations of the criminal justice system in addressing cases where severe mental illness and criminal responsibility intersect. The adversarial legal process was designed to determine guilt rather than understand or treat the psychological damage that produced her crimes. The psychological concept of systemic failure is evident throughout Aileen's life story, from the childhood abuse that was never addressed to the adult criminal behavior that was punished rather than treated. Her case represents a complete failure of every system supposedly designed to protect and rehabilitate individuals. The continuing fascination with her case reflects society's struggle to understand how someone can be simultaneously a victim deserving compassion and a perpetrator responsible for horrific crimes. She challenges conventional categories of good and evil, victim and predator. The psychological complexity of her case has made her a subject of ongoing study in criminal psychology, with researchers continuing to analyze her behavior patterns, motivations, and mental state. Her case has become a crucial example for understanding female serial killing and trauma-related violence. Her transformation from abused child to serial killer represents one of the most extreme examples of how childhood trauma can destroy normal moral development and create individuals capable of extraordinary violence. Her case study has become essential reading in forensic psychology programs. The psychological questions raised by her case continue to influence discussions about criminal responsibility, mental illness, and the possibility of rehabilitation for severely damaged individuals. Her story challenges simple notions of justice and punishment. The ultimate psychological tragedy of Aileen Wuornos is that she represents both the worst of human cruelty, the systematic abuse that created her, and the most extreme response to that cruelty, the serial murder that defined her. Her case demonstrates how evil can create evil in an endless cycle of violence and trauma. Understanding her psychology provides crucial insights into the development of criminal behavior, the long-term consequences of childhood trauma, and the complex relationship between victimization and violence. Her case remains one of the most important and disturbing examples of how human beings can be destroyed and transformed by extreme abuse. The psychological lesson of Aileen Wuornos is that monsters are made, not born, through systematic failure of every institution and individual supposed to protect vulnerable children. Her case stands as a warning about the devastating consequences when society fails its most vulnerable members, creating individuals capable of extraordinary violence who challenge our understanding of human psychology and moral responsibility.